All right, so we'll say good morning. An incredible daf ahead of us today. Begin by thanking our sponsors, to thank Sammy and Malka Esterson, our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Kislev, for dedicating all the shiurim and drashas this month in memory of their parents, Yitzchok Leib ben Aaron HaKohen, Sarah Rachel Bas Baruch Avram, and Hinda Bas Hanech Ephraim. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, the Neshamos will have an aliyah and the family Ein Nechama. Our week of learning sponsors, Matt and Diane Marks, in honor of the birth of their granddaughter, Rina Bracha Dorfman. May she go from strength to strength in Mazel Tov. Our Daf Yomi sponsors, Menashe Bracha Efron, in memory of Bracha's mother, Chava Kohn, Chava Tolchinsky, Chava Bas Avram, on the occasion of her 8th yard site. We hope that the Neshama has an aliyah and the family Ein Nechama. And the Daf Yomi sponsorship in the Schus of Refuah Shalema for Ruchama Aviva Bas Sheinachana, as well as for Rachel Yehudis Bas Tova Gittel. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, Kol Cholei Yisrael endure or experience a complete and enduring refuah. And I want to say, with that, let us begin. So today's daf is Yud Beis, right? Yeah, Yud Beis sounds good. Let's do Yud Beis. Good. I want to say, so today's daf is Yud Beis. We are picking up in Meretz Hashem at Yud Aleph Amud Beis at the Gemara. So a lot to do today in Meretz Hashem. So remember again, we saw the Mishnah, and the Mishnah itself recorded a machlokes, ultimately again in the halachos concerning the timing of the Isser of Chametz. So we saw the position of Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Huda, and ultimately again Rabbi Gamliel. So we're going to analyze over the course of the Gemara. So Tnan Hasam, Echad Omer B'Shnayim B'Chodesh. So we'll say, we're going to go ahead and give a little bit of background to this machlokes Rabbi Meir. So we'll say, understand, whenever you see machloksim in time, so machloksim in time, it could be based on one of two things: either interpretation of psukim, that's always a possibility, or a concern of general confusion, right? Either of those ultimately could go ahead and create the machlokes in time. So the Gemara is trying to lay the foundation ultimately for what is the source of this machlokes. So Tanan Hasam, Echad Omer B'Shnayim B'Chodesh, Echad Omer B'Shlosha, Edusan Kayemes. So let's listen to this. Two guys show up, right? Reuven and Shimon. Reuven and Shimon show up and they say, we testify, we saw Levi kill Yehuda. There's only one problem. Reuven says that Levi killed Yehuda on the 2nd of the month. And Shimon says Levi killed Yehuda on the 3rd of the month. So the Gemara says the testimony is still valid. We don't consider them as if they're contradicting each other. Why? For one simple reason. So both say from last week's daf, one of them realized that last month was a 29-day month, and one guy thought that it was a 30-day month. So that's an honest mistake. That could just happen. That before the set calendar, people get confused about timing, and therefore again they're just off by a day. However, if one goes ahead and says the murder occurred on the 3rd day of the month, and the other guy says no, it occurred on the 5th day of the month, that disparity cannot be reconciled, and therefore again the eidos is batal. The eidos is not good. But say, listen to this. What happens if one guy said, called Reuven, said the murder happened in the 3rd hour into the day, and Shimon said, the 2nd hour into the day, and Shimon said no, it was the 3rd hour into the day. Eidos kayemes. Ultimately, again, the eidos works, right? The eidos is valid. The testimony is valid. And Rashi points out over here, Rashi says, it's the last two lines, the short lines of Rashi, because they're both saying there is always some margin of error. In other words, people are often not totally exact. So because of that, Reuven said it happened in the 2nd hour, Shimon said it happened in the 3rd hour. That's fine. That's within the acceptable margin of error. However, what happens if halacha l'maisa, Reuven says the murder occurred in the 3rd hour, Shimon says the murder occurred in the 5th hour, edusan betela. Ultimately, again, their eidos is batal divrei Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir says, Rabbi say, that is too much of a disparity, right? To being off by 2 hours, ultimately, again, does not work, and therefore, halacha l'maisa, the eidos is batal. Rabbi Huda Omer, edusan kayemes. Rabbi Huda says, no, the eidos is good. We'll explain why this is. Echad Omer b'chamesh, Echad Omer b'sheva. But what happens if Reuven says, so therefore, what you begin to see is, Rabbi Meir does not allow a 2-hour disparity. Rabbi Huda does allow up to a 2-hour disparity. However, Echad Omer b'chamish, Echad Omer b'sheva, I do some betela. If Reuven said that murder happened in the 5th hour, and Shimon said the murder happened in the 7th hour, then ultimately, again, their eidos is batal. Why is that? It's a 2-hour disparity. The Gemara says very simply, Shebe chamish chama b'mizrach, u'b'sheva chama b'mayrav. We'll say there's different, because even though it's a 2-hour disparity, the sun is in a fundamentally different location in the 5th hour and in the 7th hour. In the 5th hour, ultimately, again, the sun is in the east. In the 7th hour, the sun is in the west. So therefore, because of that disparity, that even Rabbi Yehuda, who would normally allow for a 2-hour disparity, says that's too much, right? That's too much of a disparity. So the Gemara says, Amar Abaye. So we'll say, let's analyze this, because this is really quite interesting. And I will say, I think for many of us, when you see this seems to fly in the face of our Makkos education, right? Because again, at some point in time over the course of your learning career, you've seen Makkos, right? And one of the things usually, again, that we seem to learn about testimony is that it really needs to line up pretty exactly. Yet interestingly enough, Rabbi Yehuda seems to allow for up to a 2-hour disparity, provided that again, there's not a, we'll call it solar disparity, right? If it's 5 to 7 where there's a disparity in the position of the sun, that you can't reconcile, and the edus will be batal. Amar Abaye says as follows: Kishatin Salomar L'Devi Rabbi Meir Ein Adam Toav Lo Klum. So we'll say ultimately again, so Abaye says, according to Rabbi Meir, you have to say that a person doesn't make a mistake, right? In Rabbi Meir's view, we don't allow for any disparity, right? In other words, which is a different way of saying, in Rabbi Meir's worldview, we believe that people have the ability to be exact. I said the Gemara says, L'Devi Rabbi Yehuda Adam Toav Chatzi Shah. And according to Rabbi Yehuda, people could err up to a half hour. Now, both say, now what does that mean? Watch this. Now, remember again, it's interesting that you're going to say that according to Rabbi Meir, people don't make a mistake, because after all, Rabbi Meir said, which case does work? If Reuven says the 2nd hour and Shimon says the 3rd hour, Rabbi Meir says that does work. So obviously, Rabbi Meir does allow for some mistake. The Gemara says, no. Listen to how Rabbi Meir interprets that. The Gemara says, so we'll say, listen to this. When Rabbi Meir was machshir in the case of Reuven saying the 2nd hour, Shimon saying the 3rd hour, what really happened was as follows. The murder itself happened at the end of the 2nd hour, beginning of the 3rd hour. So the Gemara says, V'hadekamer shtayim b'sof shtayim. So Reuven, who said the murder happened in the 2nd hour, what did he really mean? The end of the 2nd hour. V'hadekamer shalosh, and when Shimon says, no, it happened in the 3rd hour, b'tchila shalosh, ultimately it was referring to the beginning of the 3rd hour. So in fact, you're not contradicting each other at all. They're just talking in different ways. So one calls, so it happened in that period, literally from end of the 2nd into the 3rd. One calls that the 2nd, one calls that the 3rd, but they're really talking about the same exact time. And therefore, we'll say in Rabbi Meir's view, remember again, this is Abaye's interpretation. And Abaye's interpretation, according to Rabbi Meir, people are exact. L'divrei Rabbi Yehuda, Adam Toa Chatzi Shah. So according to Rabbi Yehuda, people make a mistake up to a half hour. How so? So ultimately, again, when the event occurred, it occurred. So we'll see, remember again, that Rabbi Yehuda even allows for what? Rabbi Yehuda even allows if Reuven says the 3rd hour and Shimon says the 5th hour. Rabbi Yehuda says we allow for an error in judgment up to a half hour. How does that work over here? So watch this. The event itself occurred when? It really happened in the middle of the 4th hour. So what happens? The guy who says ultimately again the 3rd hour, B'sof shalosh, he means the end of the 3rd hour. And therefore he's off by a half hour. The Gemara says he's off by a half hour because the event really happened a half hour later. The guy who said it happened in the 5th hour, really when did it happen? What happened? He really meant the beginning of the 5th hour. And therefore the katoi pago the shaita la'achore. And therefore he's off by an hour behind him, backwards. So therefore, say, interestingly enough, so according to Abaye, Rabbi Meir pretty much allows for no disparity, and the way you reconcile the case of hour number 2, hour number 3 is that they're both just referring to the same time frame in different ways. And according to Rabbi Yehuda, we allow a disparity of up to a half hour in between them. Others explain, Amr Abai, Kishatim Zom, Rabbi Meir, Adam Toeh Mashahu, the Divi Rabbi Yehuda, Adam Toeh Sha'a Umashahu. We'll say an alternate version of Abaye. And in this version of Abaye, he says as follows, that according to Rabbi Meir, people could be off by a little. And according to Rabbi Yehuda, witnesses could be off by up to an hour and a little. How so? L'divrei Rabbi Meir Adam Toeh Mashahu. According to Rabbi Meir, people could be off by a little bit. Ma'aseh ki havo. Because also when this event occurred, and I remember again, this is talking about first. Well, let's see. Ma'aseh ki havo. But remember again, Rabbi Meir only allows only is machshir the testimony when they're quote unquote off by an hour. Right? When Reuven says hour number 2, Shimon says hour number 3. But in fact, in this version of Abaye, they're really going to be off by a little bit. What's the little bit? Ma'aseh hava, o b'sof shtayim, o b'tchila shalosh. The murder itself actually happened either at the end of the second hour or the third hour. V'chad minayu toeh mashu. And someone's just off by a little bit. So let's say, for example, the murder happened at the beginning of the third hour. So Reuven says it happened in the second hour. He really means the end of the second hour. So he's off by a little bit. So that little bit, Rabbi Meir will allow for some small margin of error. Divrei Rabbi Yehuda, Adam Toeh Sha'u Mashu. According to Rabbi Yehuda, however, witnesses can be off by up to an hour and a bit. How so? When Reuven says hour number 3, Shimon says hour number 5, Ki hava, when the murder actually occurred, O b'sof shalosh, O b'tchilas chamish. The murder actually happened at the beginning of at the end of the third hour, the beginning of the fifth hour, top of Yud Beis. V'chad minayu kata sho mashu, and one of the witnesses was just off by an hour and a bit. So both say these are the two versions of Abaye. In version number 1, Rabbi Meir allows for no margin of error. People are exact. Rabbi Huda ultimately again allows for a half-hour margin of error. In version number 2 of Abaye, Rabbi Meir allows for what we call a mashahu. Both say mashu literally is what? Right? Moments, a few minutes. They could be off, obviously. So you make a mistake between the end of the second hour, beginning of the third hour, that's fine. So if you're off by a couple of minutes, that's fine. According to Rabbi Yehuda, you could be off by up to an hour and a couple of minutes. Let's analyze this. Azur Rav Huna B'Rei Rabbi Yehuda, both side top of Yud Beis Amud Aleph, second line. Salzur Rav Huna B'Rei Rabbi Yehuda, Amar L'Shmaitei Kamei Dirava. So Rabbi Yehuda went, Rav Huna B'Rei Rabbi Yehuda said over this ruling of Abaye in front of Rava. Amar, so Rava says, I don't understand. Uma ilu daikinan bahani sahadi. Dahai dika amar shalosh betchila shalosh. Vahai dika amar chamesh besof chamesh. Vahavye edus muchashes velo katlinon. So Rava says like this. Let's say you were to be mavarer a little bit, right? Let's say you were to be mavarer. And you were to actually ask the witnesses and drill down to exactly what time they saw the event. And let's say again, they were able to be specific, right? People say they know. I know for sure it was at 2:47, and Shimon says I know for sure that it was 3:03. So Rabbi says we throw out the eidos. In other words, if they say with absolute certainty, and their times don't line up, we throw out the eidos. But now because we can't drill down with absolute certainty, we're going to go ahead and therefore as a result, so again, let me read the Gemara. If we were to drill down, and we get exact details, and Reuven were to say I saw the murder at 2:47, and Shimon were to say I saw the murder at 3:03, we would say that's the Eidos Mucheshes, they're contradicting each other. V'lo katlinon, and therefore we would not execute someone based on a testimony. Va'anon nekum benaktil misveka, but now both say in a case where you ask Reuven exactly what time did you see, and Reuven says, you know what? It was somewhere towards the end of the second hour. And Shimon says, I can't be exact, somewhere in the third hour. And now we're going to interpret those times to be the same and kill someone. So Rabbi says it doesn't make any sense. If they were to be exact and the times don't line up, we would throw the eidos out. But now because they're imprecise, we're going to read in a level of precision into their imprecise statements. And based on that, we're going to kill someone? Rav says counterintuitive. It doesn't make sense. If Rachman Amar, the Torah says, "V'shaftu ha'eda v'tzilo ha'eda." They will say in general, in capital cases, we do whatever we can to save someone from the death penalty. That's the general mahalich of the Jewish legal system. So you're going to tell me now, when people are imprecise in their words, we're going to interpret their words in a way that could lead to the death sentence of someone? It doesn't make any sense. Ela Amar Rava says, rather, let me give you a different interpretation. Listen to this. The Rabbi Meir Adam Toeh Shtei Shos Chaser Mashu. So Rava says like this. According to Rabbi Meir, a person could make a mistake of up to 2 hours and a bit. Which also says this is getting much more dramatic now. The Divrei Rabbi Huda, but according to Rabbi Huda, Adam Toeh Shalosh Shos Chaser Mashu. A person could go ahead and make a mistake of up to 3 hours and a bit. We'll say, so if you take, there's okay, there's a Rashi. Fine, we'll go on. So a person could go and make a mistake of up to 3 hours and a bit. So what does this mean? L'divrei Rabbi Meir, Adam Toeh Shtei Shos Chaser Mashu. So according to Rabbi Meir, a person can make a mistake of up to 2 hours and a bit. The Gemara says, Ma'aseh ki hava, o b'tchila shtayim, o b'sof shalosh. When ultimately, again, the event occurred, the event itself occurred. The was either at the beginning of 2 hours, at the second hour, or at the end of the third hour. And ultimately again, and one of them made a mistake of up to 2 hours and a bit. The Rabbi Yehuda, according to Rabbi Yehuda, person can make a mistake of even up to 3 hours and a bit. So Gemara says, ultimately, again, when the event occurred, was either at the beginning of the third hour or the end of the fifth hour. And one of them made a mistake of up to 3 hours and a bit. So Rabbi Meir ultimately understands that the ability to experience that the window for disparity can actually be much greater than Abaye's window of disparity. Now again, we'll see how this position of Rava reconciles his initial question on Abaye. We'll get to that. So Tanan, Abba said, listen to this. Let's analyze a bit. And you're going to see, by the way, what the connection to Chametz is over here. You'll see in a moment why we're bringing this in. So Tanan, Hayu Bodkin Oso B'Sheva Chakiros. We'll say back to Eidos. In general, when someone would come in to give testimony, specifically in a capital case, we would check them with 7 chakiros, right? Seven. I mean, chakiro, we could literally translate as questions also, right? 7 chakiros. What are the chakiros? Be'eza shavua. So we'll say be'eza shavua means which part of the Shemitah cycle are we in? Remember again, there are 7 Shemitah cycles in one Yovel cycle. So question number 1, you said you saw the murder. So which Shemitah cycle of the Yovel cycle, right? What number Shemitah cycle of the Yovel cycle did you see the murder? That's Be'eza Shavua, Be'eza Shana, and then ultimately again, what year? So again, Rashi points out over here, Shel Shemitah, what year of the Shemitah cycle did you see the murder? Be'eza Chodesh, what month? Bekama b'chodesh, what day of the month? Be'eza yom, Bekama b'chodesh, Be'eza yom, what day of the week? Be'eza shah, what time? Be'eza makom, and what place? B'tanya, and we learned, Ma bein chakiros lebedikos. So remember again, in addition to these chakiros, there's also a whole system of what we call bedikos. Now, if you look at Rashi for just a moment, Rashi says this is 2, 4, 6, about 6 lines in the wide lines of Rashi, the end of the line. V'tanya ma bein chakiros lebedikos. Rashi says over here, diktani hasam makirim atem also. Hatirasem bo, hisreisem bo, b'ma hargo, b'sayiv hargo, o ba'aririn hargo, kelev shchorin, o levanim v'chalamari b'dikos, harizem meshubach. So we'll say, interestingly enough, b'dikos, so chakiros are really questions regarding the timing of the incident, right? What part of the Yovel cycle, what part of the Shemitah cycle, what year, what month, what day, what hour. The b'dikos are more the details of the event that occurred. What weapon, what was the murder weapon, right? What was the murderer wearing? Things like that. So this is actually very interesting. Ma bein chakiros lebedikos. Rabbi say, what's the chilik between chakiros and bedikos? Chakiros amar echrem eni yodea edusan betela. Well, say, interestingly enough, by one of the chakiros, if one of the witnesses says, I don't know, the whole edus is done. Right, so if you don't know what year of the Shemitah cycle it was, you're out. You don't know what year of the Yovel cycle you're out. You don't know what time it was, you're out. Yet bedikos afilu shneim ein anu yodim edus b'kayamas. Well, so yet interestingly enough, By bedikos, even if both of them say we don't know. For example, what color clothing was the murderer wearing? I don't know. I don't know what clothing he was. I don't know what he was wearing. Right? I know it was Levi. I saw Levi there. I don't know what clothing. So we'll say, interestingly enough, we don't throw eidos at Nabos, and I want to be clear. However, just because you don't throw eidos out doesn't mean you automatically accept it either. But what it's saying is the inability to answer one of the bedika questions does not go ahead and immediately nullify the eidos. So the Gemara says, "V'havinan ba, ma'ishna chakiros umashna bedikos." So we'll say, why is that? The Gemara says, I don't understand. Why is the inability to answer one of the bedikos any less severe than the inability to answer one of the chakiros? So the Gemara says, second wide line of both say, "Va'aminan chakiros amar echme ini odea edusam betela tahavyela edos shiata yachal lazima." Wow. Let's say it's been a while for many of us since we've seen that phrase, right? Because what happens? See, they both say, in order for an eidos to be accepted, it has to be what's called an eidos shiachol lahazima. What does this mean? So both say, eidim, any set of eidim that are going to testify regarding in a beis din, have to be subject to hazama. Hazama is the process where they could be proven to be fraudulent witnesses. How do you prove someone to be a fraudulent witness? Two other witnesses show up and they say, it is impossible that you witnessed that event. Why? Two words. Imanu hayisem. You were with us at that particular time. Therefore, we'll say, if an edus is not subject to hazama, to be made fraudulent, it is not a proper edus, which makes sense, because at the end of the day, if you're not giving testimony in a way which can be disproven, then what skin do you have in the game to tell the truth? So therefore, I will say, interestingly enough, the chakiros questions are incredibly important, because the chakiros questions are what create an eidos that is subject to hazama, that is subject to being disproven. But if you can't answer one of the chakira questions, then you can't be disproven. That's different than the bedikos. You see, the problem that if you can't answer one of the bedika questions, then we're left wondering a little bit, like, are you sure you really saw what you saw? So that's a beis din issue that beis din has to clarify. But lamaisa, the chakiros question are what make the eidos subject to azama. So therefore, again, the Gemara says, and any eidos that's not subject to azama, ultimately, again, is not accepted. Bedikos eidos sha'atu yachal azimui. The Gemara says, bedikos, even if one of the witnesses, or even if both the witnesses can't answer some of the Vedika questions, the Eidos itself is still subject to Hazama. So the Gemara says, now watch this. Now remember again, both according to Abaye and to Rava, but really even more according to Rava. Right? According to Rava, in Rava's view, Rabbi Yehuda allows an error of up to 2 hours and a bit, and Rabbi Meir allows ultimately again for an error of up to 3 hours and a bit. So we'll say, so if you're really allowing that margin of error, ultimately, again, when it comes to testifying about the time that the witnesses saw the murder occur, so we'll say, so then again, haven't you created effectively an eidos shata yachal hazima? Why, Rabbi say, why? What could happen? Right? Reuven and Shimon show up to say, we saw Levi murder Yehuda. We'll say, good. So, and then when? Somewhere, second hour, third hour. And then what happens? We'll say, then witnesses show up and say, second hour, you were having breakfast with us in the second hour. How could you have seen it? No, so it wasn't the second hour. No, I'm not clear on the times. And Rabbi Meir says, I have up to 3 hours and a bit. Rabbi says, up to 3 hours and a bit. You've created an eidos shiata yachal hazima. Then that eidos can never be proved to be fraudulent, because you have a built-in margin of error that essentially becomes like an escape for false witnesses. To which the Gemara says, no. Di'avinale kule tosaihu. But say, what's the case? If you look at Rashi, umeshani, it's Rashi 2, 4, 6, 8 lines up from the bottom. Umeshani di'avina luhu kule tosaihu. V'im yesh mazimin kan yicholam lahaziman ayidei shav v'tausa v'lamar kala shav v'tausa hainu iman. I will say, interestingly enough, according to these approaches, Einach inami, the way Hazama works is that Hazama would have to, the Eidim Mazimin, right? The Mazimin, the witnesses who come along to prove that Reuben and Shimon, the first set of witnesses, are fraudulent, would have to prove that those witnesses could not have witnessed the event both during the stated hour as well as during when? During when? Any of the margin of error time as well. So it doesn't mean that they're not subject to Hazama. What it means ultimately is that the halacha of Hazama says that you have to go ahead and prove that these witnesses could not have seen the event at the time they say the event occurred, and what? And any potential margin of error as well. So it does up the threshold for Hazama, but it is still an edus that is subject to Hazama. Rabbi Meir Yavinu le mitchila sharishona ad sof chamesh. So let's listen to this. So according to Rabbi Meir, therefore again halacha lamais, you would create ultimately again. If you look at Rashi says with Rabbi Meir, before we read this in the Gemara, Rabbi Meir says, Rabbi Meir Amar Adam to Beishos Yavinu lahu lahani dishtayim v'shalosh mitchilas sha'arishona ad sof chamesh bein shneim. So listen to this. So therefore, it turns out that according to Rabbi Meir, right, the margin of error essentially would be. This is talking about a guy, ultimately, again, who says, right, you would give him the margin of error from the beginning of the first hour at sof chamesh until the end of the fifth hour. Maybe you should even go ahead and give him a little bit time earlier time. Ella ben yamama lalayla lo toy inish. But we'll say the problem is, remember, just like we said that people don't make a mistake between the fifth hour and the seventh hour, because halacha l'maisa, again, the sun is in different positions. So too, again, people don't make a distinction between night and day. So meaning, I could back up and I could move forward a margin of error, but once that margin of error moves into daylight versus nighttime, people don't make that kind of mistake. Rabbi Huda, according to Rabbi Huda, ultimately, again, the margin of error would be between the first hour and the sixth hour. So we'll say, before you turn the page, look at Rashi. Rabbi Huda, the Amar Adam to Gimel shows, according to Rabbi Huda, who says that a person can make a mistake up to 3 hours and a bit actually. Fine, according to Rabbi Huda, so you can make a mistake up to 3 hours, then what? You give him from the beginning of the first hour until the end of the sixth hour. And really we should back it up even a little bit more. Amud Beis, Ella, Ben Yamama Lalayla, Lo To Inish. But ultimately, again, we assume that people do not make a mistake between ultimately, again, day and night. The Gemara says, Ubedinhu, Denesev Lekamei Tvei. And in reality, we should add on more time as well. Ella Shebehei Chama Bizrach, Ubezayin Chama Marav. Well, as we said before, that Allah Chalamai said people don't make a distinction between the fifth hour or make a mistake between the fifth hour and the seventh hour. Why? Because the sun is in different positions. So I will say, so here's what's interesting. So what comes out over here is that, we'll see how the Allah Chalamai. So what comes out over here is that according to this approach, even if there's a margin of error is always capped at certain, what we'll call it certain, what's the right word? Certain just, we'll call it realities. Like people might make a margin of error in time, but people do not make a mistake between daytime and nighttime, right? People don't make a mistake between before noon, let's call it, and afternoon. Now, noon itself, we'll see, could be a subject of some confusion, but people don't make a mistake between the morning and the afternoon where the sun is in different positions. So even though we allow a margin of error, we assume that people are still cognizant with, we'll call it, major events. Okay, so Tanan, we'll say, let's analyze. So remember again, so the Gemara says, so Tanan, we learned it on Mishnah. So we'll say, now let's bring this all back. So this happens to be a fascinating machlokes. We'll say it's a fascinating machlokes also because it's a machlokes in human nature about how attentive people are in general to what it is that they observe. You see, what's fascinating about this is as follows. In Abaye's model, remember, in the first version, there are two versions of Abaye. In the first version of Abaye's model, there was a sheet of Rabbi Meir that said people don't make mistakes. Now, let me rephrase that. Right? People make mistakes, meaning that people could be exact with their time. People could be exact. If you notice again in every subsequent version, that doesn't even come on the radar. Right? In the second version of Abaye, it's not like that. In both versions, ultimately in the version of Rava, it's not like that. So just pointing out, it's a fascinating insight that can people be exact with what it is that they see? One version of Abaye says yes, but everyone else says no. And then the shaila just becomes, how much of a margin of error do we assume is acceptable? So let's come back to chametz. So Tanan, here we go. Rabbi Meir Omer Ochlin Kol Hey, V'sarfen B'tchilas Vav. Rabbi Huda Omer Ochlin Kol Dalin, V'tolin Kol Hey, V'sarfen B'tchilas Vav. So we'll say, let's analyze. So now, I will say, remember again, see, I just want to point out, remember, it was Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Huda who had this whole machlokes, ultimately again, by Eidos. They both say, what is at the core of their machlokes? What's the core of the disputes? What's the core of the dispute? The core of the dispute is, we don't really trust people to be totally exact. right? That people often are not totally exact. So therefore, we have to assume that people have a margin of error in what time they think it is. Oh, well, if that's the case, when it comes to chametz, that's pretty significant. So now watch this. I will say now you have a new appreciation of Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Huda's shitos legabe chametz. Because watch this. Remember, what did we see in the Mishnah? Rabbi Huda says that halacha l'mais. I'm sorry. Rabbi Meir says you could eat chametz the whole morning up through the 5th hour, and you begin to burn chametz at the beginning of the 6th hour. Right? So according to Rabbi Meir, now also remember again. I know you know this, but just important to say it again. When chametz becomes aser mid'oraisa, when end of the 6th hour. That's the isur d'oraisa. Midirabbanon, the Rabbanon backed it up to the beginning of the 6th hour. So Rabbi Meir says you could eat chametz until the beginning of the 6th hour. Well, let's listen to this. Rabbi Yehuda says no. You could eat through the 4th hour. Then we have this concept of tolin, which we'll discuss in greater depth, which essentially means suspended, right? Suspended. What does it mean suspended? You could get benefit from the chametz, but you cannot eat the chametz during the 5th hour, and you go ahead and burn the chametz already beginning the 6th hour. So let's analyze this. La Abaye alibud Rabbi Meir da Amar ein adam toeh lo klum nechal kulishis. So let's listen to this. According to the first version of Abaye, right? Abaye, in Abaye's first version of Rabbi Meir, what was the sheet? Rabbi say, people don't make mistakes. So Rabbi remember again, according to Rabbi Meir, when Reuven says, "I saw the murder at hour number 2," and Shimon says, "I saw the murder at hour number 3," how did Abaye interpret that first version of Abaye? How did he interpret it? That Reuven was saying what? The end of hour number 2. And Shimon was saying beginning of hour number 3. So they're really saying the same time. They're saying the same, that they're just articulating it different ways. In the first version, ultimately again, of Rabbi Meir, according to Abaye, people don't make mistakes. I could be exact with time. Oh, you could be exact with time. So then why not allow people to go ahead and what? Nechal kulashis. Let people eat the entire 6th hour. And let people burn chametz when chametz becomes aser mid'oraisa. In other words, if you trust people to be exact, so then why deprive people of an extra hour of chametz consumption? Let people eat chametz through the end of the 6th and burn it at the end of the 6th, when is the actual biblical shas iser. To which the Gemara says, lahach lishna nami damar adam to amashu. And I will say, even according to the second version of Abaye, right? The second version of Abaye, where Abaye says, according to Rabbi Meir, no, people can make a little bit of a mistake. That's fine. Nechol asofshis. So we'll say, let people eat towards the end of the 6th hour. So we'll say, let people stop eating, 45 minutes into the 6th hour, because we're concerned people get confused about a little bit. But why do you have to back up the shas iser to the beginning of the 6th hour? Furthermore, I'm going to both say, in Abaye's first version, where according to Rabbi Huda, people can make a mistake of up to a half hour, nechol ad palgadishis, then you should be able to eat when? Until 6.5 hours. And even if halach lamaisi, in the second version of Abaye, where he holds that Rabbi Huda says that people make a mistake of up to an hour and a little bit, nechol ad sof hey. Let people eat at least till the end of the 5th hour. But why would Rabbi Yehuda say that halacha l'mais you can only eat until the end of the 4th hour? So I'll say, so you hear the shayla Rabbi saying, according to either version of Abaye, according to Rabbi Meir, really people should be able to eat really until when? Till the mamish the end of the 6th hour, or even if you want to back it up a couple of minutes. At most, a couple of minutes people make a mistake. And according to Rabbi Yehuda, people for sure should be able to eat until when? To the beginning of the 6th hour. Yet Rabbi Yehuda holds that you can only eat until when? The end of the 4th hour. So what's the pshat? To which the Gemara says something very simple. Amar Abaye, it's very simple. Eidos masur l'zrizim, chametz masur lakol. We'll say a very profound statement. Abaye says, Eidos is only given to those who are zoras, right? Those who possess the midah of alacrity, those who are careful. But chametz is given over to everyone. Which is a different way of saying that essentially, if you're going to be a witness in a capital case, so at the end of the day, there is such drisha v'chakira, right? There is such examination and cross-examination that at the end of the day, the only way the eidos holds up is if you are zaras. Zaras in this context means a very precise, detail-oriented, exact individual. But if you're not going to be a proper aid. We'll say the Isra of Chametz is given to everyone. And the reality of we'll say is what? Some people are timely and some people are not, right? Some people are chronically late to anything and everything, and some people are good with time. So Lemais, again, you're going to start relying on the fact that Ruvain, who's never been on time to anything in his life, never been on time to anything in his life, you're going to rely on him now to be exact, that he could eat until the end of the 6th hour when we're dealing with an Isser D'Oraisa? That's ridiculous. Se'edos, we'll say only the most meticulous make it through the process of Jisha v'Chakira. Chametz is everyone. So whenever you legislate the halacha has to be able to accommodate everyone. And because there are many, many, many people who are simply not timely or not conscious of time, therefore, again, you have to back up the Shas Isser. Simple Yisod. V'Rava, so we'll say, now let's go on Rava's model. V'Rava, Libud Rabbi Meir, Damar Adam Toa Shtei Shos Chaser Mashu. So let's listen to this. Now, remember again, Rava had a much more expansive framework. So according to Rava, he holds that according to Rabbi Meir, a person can make a mistake of up to 2 hours, Chaser Mashu. Literally, again, 2 hours minus a bit. Therefore, again, Mitchilas Helo Nechol. So the Gemara says, therefore, we really shouldn't eat from the beginning of the 5th hour. Or back it up even more. Because we'll say people make a mistake of up to 2 hours and a bit, then really, again, from the beginning of the 5th hour, people really should not be able to eat. So the Gemara says, and remember, Rabbi Meir holds that you can eat up until the 6th hour, to which the Gemara says, hey, chama b'mizrach v'zayin chama marav. So we'll say, no, there's a big difference. The 5th hour, ultimately, again, the sun is in the east. The 7th hour, which I will say is the beginning of the Shas Isser Mid'Oraisa, the sun is in the west. So because there is something identifiable and observable to mark the difference in these two times, we assume that people will be cognizant. Ihachi b'shis nami nechol. 1 second, if that's the case, therefore I will say this is great, because then what you're telling me is when the Isser D'Oraisa of Chametz begins, really I will say, which is technically is the beginning of the 7th hour of the day, the sun is in the west. So there is a clear sign to be able to tell me when the Shas Isser is. Well, if that's the case, Rabbi Meir, why do you stop people from eating chametz when? At the beginning of the 6th hour. Let people eat through the 6th hour. Because this is actually very interesting. In the 6th hour, the sun is mid sky. So we'll say because of that, when it's mid sky, people get confused. Right, you get a little bit confused. So because of that, ultimately, again, Rava wanted to back it up a little bit. Rava, Alibud Rabbi Huda, and we'll say Rava according to Rabbi Huda, or I should say Rava's interpretation of Rabbi Huda. What did he hold? Da'amar Adam Toa Gimel Shas Chaser Mashu. We'll say, what's this? That a person can make a mistake of up to 3 hours and a bit. Get ready for this. If that's the case, Mitchilas Dalid Lo Nechol. Ultimately, again, really, we'll say if you can make a mistake of up to 3 hours and a bit, then in reality, the Isser Chametz for Achila should really begin when? Beginning of the 4th hour. Beginning of the 4th hour. So the Gemara says, no. Hey Chama b'mizrach, the Sheva Chama marav. We'll say, no. There, remember, you have the sun on your side, right? And therefore, again, a person could see, there's observable realities that a person could see the positioning of the sun, and they'll know when the Shas Isser begins. That's the case again, Rabbi Huda, that ultimately again, why? Remember, I will say Rabbi Huda says you can eat through the end of the 4th, Tolin in the 5th hour, and then again burn 6th hour. But according to Rabbi Huda, why can't I eat through the 5th hour as well? Tirgama Abaya Liba Derava. Eidos Masur Lizrizim, Chametz Masur, Chametz Lakol Masur. Because as we said before, already once you get into the 5th hour, now we're concerned about a more significant margin of error. So whereas Eidos ultimately again is given over to Zrizim, as we said before, Chametz is given over to all. So therefore, we'll say, in other words, that for Eidos, you're only going to be accepted if you are exact. But Chametz, ultimately, again, everyone is subject to halachas of Chametz, and therefore, again, a lot of people aren't timely, and a lot of people aren't precise. Therefore, you have to build in a buffer. The Rava says, Rava, Amar Lav Hainu Tamid Rabbi Huda. That's not the reason Rabbi Huda. Ella Rabbi Huda Tamei da Amar. Here we go. Ein Bir Chametz Ella Sreifa. But say, listen to this. According to Rabbi Huda's logic is as follows. The reason Rabbi Huda says, now remember, Rabbi Huda's model is you could eat through the end of the 4th hour. Tolin, we suspend the chametz, i.e. you can't eat it, but you can get benefit from it during the 5th hour, and then ultimately, again, you burn it in the 6th hour. So we're asking, according to Rabbi Huda, why do you need that tolen fifth hour? Why can't I eat through the fifth hour? So listen to this. I'll say this is incredible. So Rava says, I'll tell you the reason. It's totally independent of the precision issue. But rather, listen to this. Rabbi Huda says the only way to destroy your chametz is how? Ultimately, again, through burning it. That's the only way to destroy chametz. Incredible. So what happened? So Rabbi Huda wanted to give you an hour to collect firewood. So watch this. Enjoy your chametz in the morning. Eat through the fourth hour. When it says fifth hour total, you can't eat it, but you can get benefit from it. That's Rabbi Huda saying, go collect your wood for beer chametz. Go collect your wood. You've been busy with your Pesach preparations this whole time. We didn't collect the wood. Go collect the wood in the fourth hour, in the fifth hour, and therefore Allah Chalamaisa, burn your chametz in the sixth hour. So Ravina raised the kasha to Rava. So we'll say, so therefore, interestingly enough, according to Rabbi Huda, the fifth hour tolen issue is not a din in the imprecision of people, but rather ultimately, again, it's a din in bir chametz. We're giving you an hour to do bir chametz because also Rabbi Huda's shita is it's not enough to go to the river and throw your chametz into the river. You have to destroy your chametz by fire. Well, let's say you have a significant amount of fire. It's going to, a significant amount of chametz that's going to require significant fire. Significant fire requires wood. Maybe you don't have firewood gathered. So therefore, so we give you the time to assemble your firewood. And Eisvei Ravina l'Rava. So Ravina says, Ravina, no, I don't think that's it. Rabbi Huda, a masai shelo b'shas biuro. Aval b'shas biuro hashbasasa b'chol davar. So we'll say, interestingly enough, so Ravina says to Rava that there is another sheet of Rabbi Huda. That ultimately, again, Rabbi Huda says, when do we say a masai? Ultimately, again, when do I say that you can only destroy chametz through burning shelo b'shas biuro? We'll say, look at Rashi for just a moment. This is the third wide line down in Rashi. A masai ani omer ein biur chametz el sreifa. Rabbi Huda says, when do I hold that you can only destroy chametz with sreifa? When shelo b'shas biuro b'tchila sheish v'chol sheish takati b'doraisa shari. Ultimately, again, both say, when do we say that halacha l'maisa you can only go ahead and destroy chametz with fire? That's shelo b'shas biuro, right? Ultimately, again, like Rashi says, the beginning of the sixth, the whole sixth, where the chametz is only asr midrabanan but not midoraisa. Aval b'shas biuro hashbasasa b'chol davar. But I will say, once the time of isser chametz begins, you could destroy chametz any way you want. Look at Rashi. Aval b'shas biuro b'sheva shumusra min haTorah hashbasasa b'chol davar. V'torach zeh lama im ein lo itzim yamtin ad shas biuro v'yashbisenu b'chol davar. So both say, Ravina says, I don't understand. Rabbi Huda only says that burning chametz is the way to dispose of it before the biblical prohibition for chametz sets in. But once the biblical prohibition for chametz sets in, then what? You could destroy chametz however you want. So to say that Rabbi Huda builds in an extra hour to gather firewood, when in just 2 hours from now you could destroy it however you want, doesn't seem to make all that much sense. Ela Amar Rava, ultimately, we'll say, why does Rabbi Huda build in the extra hour? So we'll say, we're laser focused over here. Rabbi Huda says you can eat until the end of the fourth, tolen in the fifth, burn in the sixth. Why does Rabbi Huda need that extra buffer? Remember again, we'll say, we already have a buffer hour. What's the buffer hour? 6. Because remember again, midaraisa, chametz is not usher until the 7th hour of the day, the beginning of the 7th hour. So the Rabbana already built in a buffer hour. Rabbi Huda is building in an additional buffer hour of the 5th hour. So why is that? So we have the firewood shita. So the Gemara says, Ravina says, no, it's something else. The Gemara says, I'm sorry. This is good. Cloudy day. So I will say, remember again, all of this is predicated on being able to see the sun. The sun tells you what time of day it is. What happens if Erev Pesach is cloudy? So if Erev Pesach is cloudy, that throws everything off. So Rabbi Huda says, let's just build in an extra buffer hour to take care of a cloudy day. Well, if that's the case, then why not throw in the 4th hour also? Why don't you just go ahead and say people could only eat until the end of the 3rd hour, and already beginning the 4th hour, let's say 4th and 5th hour is tolen, 6th hour ultimately again is beer. After all, shouldn't I be concerned with a cloudy day? Amra Papa, Dalid Zman Sud Lakoli. So it was very interesting. No. You can't prohibit the 4th hour. Why? Because I will say everyone knows 4th hour is Su'uda time. people normally eat in the 4th hour, as we're going to see in just a moment. That is a normative time to have your Seudah. Therefore, Chazal did not want, even Rabbi Yehuda does not want to back up the Isra Achila to the 4th hour of the day, for that is a normative Zman Achil. That is a normative time to have your meal. So also listen to this. The Gemara says, explains, what does this mean? Look at Rashi. Zman Seudah Hilakol, Vakol B'kiyim Ba. Literally, again, we're saying everybody is proficient in that time. So we'll listen to this. It's a beautiful Gemara. Turn Rabbanon. Shari Shona, the first hour of the day, Maichal Ludim. That's when the Ludim go ahead and eat their first meal. Now we'll say that's pretty early. Why do the Ludim eat then? So we'll say, if you look at Rashi, Rashi says over here, Ludim, it's in Rashi's Man Su'uda. Rashi says, Ludim velistim Rav Sonim Hain, Ela Shalistim the Orun Kalayla, V'yeshirim Shachar Shalas. For us, listen to this. We'll say the Ludim were, Rashi points out, we'll see later on, the Ludim were cannibals. So they were a cannibalistic group. So apparently they had a very, voracious appetite. So they would already have their first meal the first hour of the day. Shnia, Maichalistim. The second hour of the day, the listim, thieves used to eat. Why will say, why are thieves eating? Now remember, the second hour of the day, it's early. Why are thieves having a meal already second hour of the day? They had a long night of theft. You get tired breaking into people's stuff. It's exhausting. So we'll say, so therefore, again, they had their Su'udah second hour of the day. Shlishis, Meichel Yarshim. So we'll say, this is very interesting. Third hour of the day, who eats third hour of the day? Yarshim, inheritors. We'll say, who are inheritors? Those are people, Baruch Hashem, who don't have to work for a living. They just inherited an incredible amount of money. Rashi says, Yarshim, Lab Mishum Ravanos, Ela Hoyo Velo Amlubo. So there's no real exertion. So therefore, again, they just go and decide to eat in the third hour of the day. Revius Machal Polim. We'll say fourth hour of the day is when workers. So remember, workers generally begin to work, let's say beginning of the day. It's already 4 hours into the day, they've been exerting themselves. So they eat fourth hour of the day. Chamishis, fifth hour of the day. Machal Talmidei Chachamim. That's when Talmidei Chacham have their first meal. Shishis, Machal Kol Adam. The 6th hour of the day is when people in general, most people, have their first meal. You understand clearly, also I want to point out that, well, we'll see. Papa says, I revius Masud Lakoli. But 1 second. You just said the 6th hour is when general people have their meal. But yet we said before that the 4th hour is when people have their meal. Ella Eifach, rather turn it around. Revius Mechol Kol Adam. The 4th hour of the day is when people generally have their meal of the day. Chamishis Mechol Poalim. The 5th hour is when workers eat. And Shishis Mechol Talmidei Chachamim. And ultimately, again, the 6th hour of the day is when Talmidei Chachamim eats. I will say, so depending on kind of what you did for a living and what your day looked like, determined your seder of meals. Mikan ve'elech, we'll say, if you eat after these times, kizorek even lechemas. Ultimately, again, it's like throwing a stone into an empty pit. So I will say the idea over here is that Chazal felt, we saw this already in Maseches Brachos, that it's important to have some type of substantive meal a little bit earlier in the day, because if you wait, or at some point by the 6th hour, because if you wait too long, then ultimately, again, what ends up happening is the meal is not as beneficial. I guess it also means like if you wait too long until you're hungry, you end up eating more than you really have to at a certain level of like ravenous consumption. Masha Inkin, if you eat a little bit earlier, you'll eat what you need, you won't overeat. So if you wait too much, it's like throwing a stone into an empty pit. The Gemara says, however, that's only true about tam, midi b'tzafra, less lanba. But if halacha l'maisa, again, you had a little something for breakfast, then even if you delayed your lunch, because also remember again, from a Talmudic perspective, you're pretty much eating 2 meals a day, not 3 meals a day. But people would eat a little something for breakfast. So they wouldn't have a meal, a little something. So as long as you ate a little something for breakfast, then even if you delayed your first major meal of the day a little bit longer, it's going to be okay. I will say we'll stop over here. We're going to pick up. So I'll say, so we're not finished with this, but at least now you see, this is really fascinating, because now you see that the Mishnah of Pesachim that dealt with, again, the machlokas about how the zmanim for Isser Chametz works is really a more fundamental machlokas by Meir and Rabbi Yehuda that really first comes about by Eidos that really focuses on how precise are people with time. We'll stop here.